Hello students. So welcome to the first class. So in today's class, I'm going to pick up my section of the syllabus, my portion, the portion that I'm going to teach you, and we are directly moving into the text. So first up, the text that I am going to teach you is called Araby. It's a short story. If you remember, I had mentioned that there are three short stories in your syllabus, and I'm sure you have all had a look at the syllabus itself. So Araby is a short story by James Joyce, and it is in my portion of the syllabus. So I'm going to teach you Araby, and today we are going to talk about this short story. All right. So without wasting further time, I am directly going to, address different matters that are related to the text and some of the things that will be necessary for you for this paper. So first, what is Araby? Araby is the name of a market, right? And this is something you get to know when you read the text. And by all means, you should all read the text. It's a very short story, only a few pages, 5 or 6 pages maybe. Do read the short story. I will see if I can share the text with you. And yeah, so Araby is the name of a market in that story, and we'll talk more about that market itself later. First, let's talk about James Joyce himself, the story in more general terms, and also the book from which the story is taken. So that will give us an idea of what the story itself is about. That will give you a better perspective, if you, if you may. So Araby, the story is one of 15 short stories that make a collection, right? It's a collection of Araby is one of the stories from a collection of 15 stories, in other words. So what is this collection called? It's called Dubliners. So in other words, for those of you who may not have been able to follow what I said just now, Dubliners is the name of a book. It contains 15 short stories, all of which are written by James Joyce, and one story from that collection is called Araby. So, although James Joyce wrote the stories between 1904 and 1906, they were not published until 1914. So, he wrote the stories nearly 8 to 10 years before they were actually published, right? So, the stories were with him for several years. So, Dubliners, this entire collection from which Araby is taken, it paints a portrait of life in Dublin. Now, what is Dublin? Dublin is a city in Ireland. It's the capital of Ireland, right? And Ireland is a country which is close to Britain, which is close to the United Kingdom. If you if you have seen the map of the world, I'm sure you have seen Ireland in it, right? Ireland is close to it's an island, of course. It's an island country, very close to England, very close to Britain. So this entire book, Dubliners, it has stories from the city of Dublin, right? Which is why it is called Dubliners. And so in this book, what James Joyce does is that he paints a picture of how life is like, or how life was like in Dublin around that time. That is in 1904, 1905. That is around the turn of the century. That is when the 19th century ended and the 20th century started. So he paints a picture of his city around that time. He's also from there. So the stories are arranged in an order reflecting the development of a child into a grown man, right? So all these 15 stories, they are not random. There is a sequence. Now, what is the sequence? The first three stories are told from the point of view of a young boy, all right, from a very young person, from a young boy. The next three are told from the point of view of an adolescent, right, and so on. So, in other words, Araby is from the collection Dubliners, like I mentioned, and in Dubliners there are 15 stories. I'm repeating some of the things I said. Hopefully, you are able to follow now. And in this 15 stories, the first three stories are from the point of view of a young boy, and the next three stories from which Araby is taken is from the point of view of someone adolescent. Now, who is adolescent? Adolescence is the period after childhood, right? So that period of a human being's life is called adolescence. All right. So Araby is the last story of that set, right? It's the last story of the three stories about adolescence from the point of view of an adolescent person, and is told from the the title of the story is taken from a real festival, right? It's taken from a real festival which was held in Dublin several years earlier, when James Joyce himself was 11 or 12 years old, right? So, in a way, while writing the story Araby, James Joyce was not just writing a story set in the city of Dublin. He was actually writing about his own adolescence when he was 12 years old. He was writing about his own experiences as a younger person. When he wrote Araby, when he wrote Dubliners, he was obviously much older, but he was reminiscing his own youth, his own adolescence. All right. So now you have a background of what Araby is about and the collection from which Araby is taken. Now let's talk about James Joyce, right, the author himself. So Joyce is one of the most famous writers of the modernist period of literature. All right. So what is modernist period of literature? Modernist period is roughly from the year is literature written between roughly 1900 1900 till the end of World War II, which is in 1945. So literature written between this time, 1900 and 1945. So this period is roughly called modernist period. Okay, and James Joyce is one of the most famous authors of this period of literature. All right, and now what is modernity about? What is modernist literature like? So modernist works often include characters who are spiritually lost, and themes. The writings are also about themes that reflect a very cynical attitude towards. Cynical means not trusting, right? You're not trusting institutions. When you don't trust colleges, schools, legal system, that is called cynicism. All right. So in modernist literature, you will see that there is a lot of cynicism towards institutions, right? And towards institutions which the author may have been fond of as a child, right? Or institutions which the author was a part of at some point in his or her life, but now he or she does not like them anymore. Think of this. James Joyce may have been and he was obviously a student at some point in his life. He may have had a job, and at some point in his life, between 1900 and 1945, he had a great dislike for all of these institutions, right? And that dislike is reflected or is present in their writings. Okay, so that is also there in Araby, Dubliners, and also in the other works that James Joyce has written. So much of the literature written in this period is very experimental. Now, what do I mean by experimental literature? It was experimental in the sense that literature like this, poems like this, short stories written during this time were not written before. All right. The techniques they were using, the style of writing, also the language they were using. Now, obviously, they were writing in English in this case, but within English, they were writing a new type of English. All right. They were making new words. James Joyce has made hundreds of new words. All right. So they were not only inventing new words, they were changing the grammar, right? So these are the kind of experiments that modernist writers were doing. So James Joyce's writing reflects this in the use of dashes, like, okay, instead of quotation marks to indicate that a character is speaking. So Joyce, you'll see in Joyce's writing, he does not use quotation marks. Normally, we use quotation marks while we quote someone, while we refer to what someone else said. For example, if someone's name is uh, for example, say someone's name is James Joyce, and when speaking about James Joyce, I will say, or I will write, James Joyce said, and then begin open quotation marks, write what he said, then end quotation marks. Are you able to follow? Now, there's no way of knowing whether you are able to follow because this is not a live class, but I'm trying to be as clear as possible. So, hopefully, you understand. Now, James Joyce, in his own writing, he did not use quotation marks. So, this was his own style. And this is, as you can understand, this is very experimental. This was not done before. So Joyce had a very difficult time getting Dubliners published. You remember, I mentioned early on quite a few minutes ago that he had written the stories in 1904, 1906, around that time, but they were not published until 1914. So he had the stories with him for 10 years and he was not able to publish, right? It took him over 10 years to find a publisher who was willing to risk publishing the stories. Why did no publisher want to publish James Joyce's work? The reason is because his work was very experimental, and the publisher, see, you have to understand that a publisher is also an investor, right? If I go to a publisher and say, see, I have written a book, publish this, he is not going to publish it without properly understanding whether my book has a market value. Correct? The same principle applies to movies, the same principle applies to songs. So this is about 1910 or 1905. This is a time when even the film industry had not really taken off, right? Hollywood had not really started at that time, for example. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that in at this period in history, during this period, writing was the most lucrative, or publishing was the most lucrative industry, right? One of the most lucrative industries. And so publishers were actually kind of investors, because you go to the publisher with a book, he's not going to just publish it, he's going to understand whether this book has proper sales potential. Now if he publishes your book, say 10,000 copies of your book, and then no one buys it, who is going to incur the loss? Not the author. The publisher is going to incur the loss. So naturally, publishers at that time did not want to publish James Joyce's book, because they thought that this book does not have market value. It does not have the required market potential. People won't buy the book if it is published, and the publisher is likely to incur a massive loss. Which is why for 10 years no one published it. So finally, around 1914, he did find a publisher, and he fought very hard with the editors to keep to keep the stories the way he had written them. Okay, now so there are multiple levels of publishing. First is the publisher itself has to agree. The publisher himself or herself or itself has to agree that okay, this book is worth publishing because there is market value. There is a potential market for this book. But that is not where publication ends. There are editors, right? And what is the job of an editor? The job of an editor is to make sure that the language is understandable, the book is readable, right? So okay, now the publisher had agreed to publish in 1914, but after the publisher agreed to publish, the book went to whom? The editors. Now the editors see while reading the book that this book has no quotation marks, this book has grammar which is never written before, this book has it does not do a lot of things which every other book does. So naturally, James Joyce had to quarrel with editors because editors wanted to change them to what is more understandable, and James Joyce said, "No, you have to publish it the way I have written it." Right? So there was a clash, but years later, the books were published, and not only do they portray the life in Berlin at the turn of the century, but also as the beginning of the career of one of the most brilliant English language writers of the 20th century. So I will end this lecture here. It's very brief. It's just an introduction to James Joyce. I hope you also have some idea about what Araby is about now, what kind of a person Araby is about, what the word Araby itself means. Like I said, it's a market. So with those things in mind, I will end today's class. I will also share the text of Araby with you. You read the text. In the next class, we will discuss the text itself.